In 1881, a settler named Percy Crothers arrived in Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory, to claim his 160 acres under the Homestead Act. He found the prairie dotted with mysterious circular depressions. Round potholes, 15 to 20 feet across, several feet deep. Some held water even in July. Others were choked with wildflowers that grew nowhere else on the flat grassland. He counted 3 or 4 per section of land. The old-timers couldn't explain them. The railroad surveyors marked them on their maps as unknown features. Nobody understood where they came from. The bison that made them were already gone. Here is what the conventional story misses. Those depressions weren't geological quirks or ancient sinkholes. They were engineering projects, thousands of years in the making, created by animals that settlers would never see alive. And when the army and hide hunters slaughtered 30 million bison between 1870 and 1884, they didn't just destroy a species. They erased a water infrastructure that stretched from Texas to Saskatchewan, covering more than 400 million acres of grassland. Researchers now estimate there may have been more than 100 million of these depressions scattered across the Great Plains. Contemporary surveys suggest 5 or more wallows per acre in prime bison habitat. The settlers who dismissed them as useless holes were standing in the ruins of an ecosystem they never knew existed. September 1879. A 12-year-old girl named Laura Ingalls sits in a covered wagon rolling west through Dakota Territory. The temperature hovers near 65 degrees. Her father, Charles, drives the team past the Big Sioux Railroad camp toward Silver Lake, where he has secured work with the Chicago and Northwestern Railway at $50 per month. Laura has never seen country like this. The grass stretches to every horizon, unbroken except for the faint lines of old trails cutting through the prairie. Paths worn deep into the ground and now grassed over. And then she notices something strange. The land is pocked with depressions, straight-sided, flat-bottomed, scattered across the rolling terrain as far as she can see. Some are 8 feet across, others span 20 feet or more. Her father explains what they are. Buffalo wallows. The great herds had grazed this country only a few years before. They had been the Indians' cattle, he tells her, and white men had slaughtered them all. Laura will never see a living bison. But she will find her baby sister Grace, lost one spring afternoon the following year, sitting in one of those old wallows, surrounded by a carpet of purple violets. The scene she recorded, a golden-haired toddler in a fairy ring of flowers, discovered in a depression carved by vanished giants, would become one of the most enduring images in American children's literature. Most readers never understood what they were looking at. The railroad camp where Laura's family will spend the winter lies 40 miles from the nearest neighbor. Buffalo wolves still prowl the stable at night. The depressions Laura observed that day, typically 8 to 12 feet in diameter, 2 feet deep at the center, represented the last visible evidence of an animal that had shaped this landscape for 10,000 years. Within a decade, homesteaders would plow most of them under. The water they held would drain away. The species that depended on them would begin to disappear. A Texas historical marker near Odessa would later describe what Laura witnessed, the remains of an epoch when great buffalo herds migrated through the region, creating efficient depressions 8 to 12 feet across and 2 feet deep through repeated wallowing in the same spots. What made a wallow? The answer begins with a bison's hide and the misery of summer on the open plains. The animals were tormented by biting flies, horseflies, deer flies, mosquitoes by the millions. Ticks burrowed into their skin. The relentless sun beat down on dark hides that could reach 130 degrees on exposed surfaces. Winter brought a different problem. A thick undercoat of fine wool that loosened as temperatures climbed, causing maddening irritation that drove the animals to distraction. The bison's solution was elegant and ancient. They rolled. They pawed the earth with hooves weighing 20 pounds each. They ground their massive bodies. Bulls averaged 1,800 pounds, sometimes exceeding a ton, into the dirt, coating themselves with dust or mud that smothered parasites and provided relief from the sun. And they returned to the same spots, year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation. The physics were simple but cumulative. Each wallowing session removed soil. Wind carried the loosened dirt away across the treeless prairie. Rain compacted what remained. The bison's weight compressed the earth beneath the depression until it formed a natural hardpan, an impermeable layer that held water like a clay pot. A single wallow might take decades to reach its full depth. But the herds had millennia. By the time Europeans arrived on the Great Plains, the prairie held more wallows than anyone could count. Early travelers thought them Indian dance rings. Others assumed they were natural depressions caused by underground springs. The truth was stranger, an entire landscape reshaped by the grooming habits of a single species. One estimate from the National Park Service suggests 5 or more wallows per acre across the prime bison range. At the Konza Prairie Biological Station in Kansas, one of the few places where researchers can study intact tallgrass prairie under controlled conditions, surveys have identified approximately 3,000 relict wallows, characterized by their circular shape and compacted soil. Managers there observe more than 1 wallow per acre, on land where bison have been reintroduced. They count roughly 11 wallows per bison, the current herd. Scale those numbers to a population of 30 million animals grazing 400 million acres across the Great Plains, and the arithmetic becomes staggering. A 2011 study estimated there may have been more than 100 million wallows across the prairie prior to European settlement. Remember that figure: 100 million potential water catchments, scattered across a near desert that receives only 15 inches of rain per year. It matters because of what those wallows became after the bison left. The Great Plains received between 15 and 20 inches of precipitation annually. East of the Mississippi, that qualifies as semi-arid conditions requiring careful water management. Rivers are few. Streams run intermittently. For 8 months of the year, surface water essentially vanishes from vast stretches of territory. The nearest reliable water source might be a day's ride distant. The bison wallows change that calculus in ways settlers would take decades to appreciate. Their compacted bottoms held rainwater for days or weeks after storms passed. Some remained wet through entire summers. In a landscape where the next reliable water might be 40 miles away, a 2-foot depression holding 50 gallons could mean survival for both human and animal. The Homestead Act of 1862 promised settlers 160 acres of free land if they could live on it and improve it for 5 years. The act required building a dwelling, cultivating the soil, and maintaining continuous residence. Between 1862 and 1900, approximately 600,000 families attempted to claim homesteads on the Great Plains. They arrived from Iowa, Minnesota, Germany, Scandinavia, Russia, drawn by railroad advertisements promising fertile soil and endless opportunity. The government granted more than 270 million acres while the law was in effect. What the promotional brochures failed to mention was the water, or rather, the absence of it. Physical conditions on the frontier presented even greater challenges than most newcomers anticipated. Wind, blizzards, and plagues of insects threatened crops. Open plains meant few trees for building, forcing many to build homes out of sod cut from the prairie itself. Limited fuel and water supplies could turn simple cooking and heating chores into difficult trials, as the National Archives would later note in its assessment of homesteading challenges. While 160 acres may have been sufficient for an eastern farmer, it was simply not enough to sustain agriculture on the dry plains. Homesteaders had to dig wells that sometimes reached 200 or 300 feet into the ground to find reliable water. Many failed within months, their claims abandoned, their dreams broken by the relentless aridity. The settlers who persisted learned to read the land differently than they had back east. They noticed that certain depressions held water longer than others after rain, that the sod cut from buffalo, wallows, where water collected and grass grew thickest, made stronger building material than sod from surrounding prairie. The roots were denser, the earth more compacted, the bricks less likely to crumble. A 2025 article in Courthouse News Service confirmed what those early sod busters discovered through trial and error. The best source material for sod houses usually came from so-called buffalo wallows, depressions on the plains where water collected. The sod there held more grass and was therefore stronger. The holes they had dismissed as useless became, for some, the difference between a house that stood and one that collapsed into mud. But the wallows offered something more valuable than building material. They offered life itself, not just for homesteaders, but for dozens of species that had evolved to exploit these scattered oases across the continental grassland. The spring of 1880 found Laura Ingalls and her family on their new homestead claim near De Smet, in what would become South Dakota. The railroad line had extended to Silver Lake, spurring rapid settlement. Settlers flooded the territory during what historians call the Great Dakota Boom. Charles Ingalls filed his homestead claim under the 1862 Act on a quarter section of land near the lake, and the family built a shanty on their new property. They broke sod with iron plows that shattered against the thick root networks of native grass. They planted. They began the 5 years of improvement required to gain title to their land. And in the old buffalo wallows south of their house, a depression roughly 2 acres in size, located halfway across the farm, according to Laura's later memoir, they watched water collect after spring rains and persist through the summer months. That wallow had not held water by accident. The bison that created it had packed the soil so tightly over generations that moisture could not percolate down through the earth. Contemporary ecologist Gordon Uno, studying wallows at the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge in Oklahoma, found that these depressions are underlain by a subsurface hardpan that restricts the downward percolation of water into the lower soil profile. After heavy rainfall, wallows fill and may remain full for days to weeks, depending on the ensuing rainfall pattern. They function, in other words, as natural cisterns, engineered by animals that vanished before most settlers arrived, but persisting across decades without maintenance. The water attracted more than thirsty homesteaders and their livestock. In the tallgrass prairie of eastern Kansas, researchers Nicole Gerlins and Dawn Kaufman of Kansas State University documented frogs breeding in bison wallows during years when cool, wet weather left the depressions flooded through spring. Their 2003 study found that reintroduced bison both reactivated old wallows and made new ones, which were then used as breeding sites by amphibians. Tiger salamanders laid their eggs in the shallow pools. Spadefoot toads, species adapted to exploit ephemeral water sources across the arid plains, completed their entire reproductive cycle in wallows that might hold water for only 3 or 4 weeks. The timing was precise, the margins thin, the dependence absolute. A 2018 study published in the journal Ecosphere by Nicol and colleagues confirmed that bison wallowing increases arthropod community heterogeneity in space and time, scientific language for a simple truth. The wallows created habitat for creatures that would otherwise have no place to live. The mechanism worked like this. Active wallows, where bison still rolled regularly, supported fewer insects and plants than surrounding prairie. The constant disturbance prevented vegetation from establishing. The soil remained bare and compacted. But abandoned wallows, what researchers call relict wallows, developed into something else entirely. Freed from disturbance, they filled gradually with sediment. Pioneer plant species colonized the bare soil. The water they collected supported different vegetation than the surrounding grass, including wetland species that required standing water to germinate, and animals responded to these resources. The Wallows became islands of biodiversity scattered across the grassland sea. At the Tall Grass Prairie National Preserve in Kansas, observers documented shorebirds using wallows as stopover sites during spring migration. American golden plovers, buff-breasted sandpipers, least sandpipers, lesser yellowlegs, species that required shallow water for feeding during their long journeys north, descended on the depressions after rains filled them with water. Long-billed curlews built nests nearby, using bison droppings as camouflage for their eggs. Birds lined their nests with bison fur, which provided critical insulation for eggs and hatchlings. Black-tailed prairie dogs preferred areas where bison grazed heavily, the short grass creating ideal conditions for digging burrows and spotting predators. The relationships multiplied in every direction. The World Wildlife Fund summarized the interconnection. Wallows collect water above ground for longer periods of time, more broadly across the landscape. Without these wallows, water would only be found in naturally occurring streams and ponds. The hide hunters did not think about prairie dogs or tiger salamanders or migrating shorebirds. They thought about money. A buffalo hide fetched $3 in 1874, and the eastern market for industrial leather seemed insatiable. Tanneries had discovered that bison hide made excellent material for machine belts, flexible, durable, capable of transferring power in the factories that were transforming American industry. A good hunter with a Sharps rifle could kill 100 animals per day, more if the wind was right and the herd remained calm. The mathematics of extermination proved irresistible. The slaughter began in earnest after the Transcontinental Railroad split the great herds in 1869. The Union Pacific Line running from Omaha to Sacramento created an impassable barrier, dividing the bison into northern and southern populations that could no longer intermingle. The southern herd, ranging from Texas through Kansas and into Colorado, died first. Commercial hunting commenced in 1874 on an industrial scale. Hunters set up temporary camps and moved in organized waves across the high plains, using breech-loading rifles to kill hundreds of animals daily. In the mid-1870s, during the peak of the slaughter in western Kansas, a buffalo hide yard would handle as many as 80,000 hides at one time. By 1878, the southern herd had effectively ceased to exist. Observers reported entire regions where not a single animal remained alive. The northern herd followed the same trajectory on a compressed timeline. Hide shipments from Dakota Territory peaked in 1882 at 200,000 skins. By 1883, the number had dropped to 40,000. The following year, only one carload shipped east. The rapid destruction can be measured in those figures. 1882, 200,000 hides. 1883, 40,000. 1884, one carload. Nationally, the population collapsed from an estimated 30 million in 1800 to fewer than 1,000 by the 1890s. Perhaps as few as 300 bison survived in the entire United States. General Philip Sheridan endorsed the destruction openly, declaring that eliminating the bison would do more to settle the vexed Indian question than anything the army could accomplish. The strategic logic was simple: destroy the commissary, and the resistance would end. The wallows remained after the bison vanished, but without animals to maintain them, to re-excavate the depressions each spring, to compact the soil with their massive weight, to keep vegetation from filling the bowls, they began to change. Grass crept inward from the edges. Sediment accumulated with each rain. The hardpan that held water began to break down as root systems penetrated the compacted layer. A 2012 analysis estimated that some modern wallows in areas where bison have been absent for more than 120 years still show evidence of their origins. Circular depressions visible in aerial photographs, slightly different vegetation marking the outline. But many thousands more have simply vanished, plowed under by farmers or erased by natural succession. The water they once held now drains into the soil and disappears. Modern ecologists have a term for what bison did to the prairie: ecosystem engineering. The concept recognizes that certain species, beavers building dams, elephants creating clearings in African forests, bison creating wallows, physically modify their environments in ways that benefit other organisms. These keystone species shape landscapes that would otherwise not exist. A 2018 study from the Ecological Society of America stated the relationship plainly. Bison wallows can often cover a substantial proportion of North American prairie habitat. The compacted soil in wallows holds open pools of rainwater that host ephemeral wetland species, akin to a vernal pool. Wallowing increases arthropod community diversity. Amphibians have been observed breeding in old wallows. Bison are considered a keystone species for prairies, meaning they have a disproportionate effect on the overall health and productivity of the ecosystem. The research confirms what Laura Ingalls intuited when she found her sister surrounded by violets in that Dakota wallow. Those depressions were not empty or useless. They were ecosystems, miniature wetlands scattered across a continental grassland, each one supporting its own community of plants and animals. The violets Grace gathered required the moist conditions the wallow provided. The insects that pollinated those flowers bred in the standing water. The frogs that ate those insects laid eggs in the same pools. The snakes that hunted the frogs basked on the wallow's sunny edges. Remove the bison that created and maintained the depressions, and the entire cascade begins to collapse. How many species depended on buffalo wallows? The question resists easy quantification because the relationships were so diffuse and interconnected. Wallows supported different plant communities than surrounding prairie. Annual forbs rather than perennial grasses. Species adapted to periodic flooding rather than constant drought stress. Those plants attracted different insects than the surrounding grassland. Those insects fed different birds. The wallows themselves provided breeding habitat for amphibians that in turn fed snakes, hawks, foxes, and coyotes. Contemporary researchers at the Nature Conservancy describe the relationship as a trophic cascade, a chain of ecological consequences flowing from a single source. Consider the Great Plains toad, one of the most common amphibians of the western grasslands. This species breeds explosively after heavy rains, laying as many as 45,000 eggs in temporary pools. Its tadpoles must metamorphose before the water evaporates, a window of perhaps 30 to 50 days depending on temperature and rainfall patterns. Buffalo wallows, holding water longer than surrounding depressions because of their compacted bottoms, provided ideal breeding habitat. Without them, toads must rely on agricultural stock ponds, roadside ditches, or the increasingly rare natural playa lakes. The Montana Field Guide now lists long-term declines as possible due to declines in ephemeral water bodies, explicitly identifying bison wallows as a category of lost habitat. The Great Plains toad faces threats from habitat loss, including drought, agricultural practices, and reduced availability of breeding sites. The settlers could not have known any of this in 1880 or 1890. They arrived on a landscape already wounded, the bison gone, the wallows beginning to fill with sediment and vegetation, the amphibians that depended on them entering a decline that would accelerate across the next century. What the newcomers saw were holes in the ground scattered across their claims. Some held water after storms. Some grew flowers in spring. Most seemed like obstacles to be plowed flat and planted over with wheat or corn. The systematic destruction of habitat struck them as improvement. The tragedy was not simply the destruction of the bison, though that loss was catastrophic in its own right. It was the erasure of the system the bison had created over 10,000 years of continuous presence on the Great Plains. An estimated 100 million water catchments scattered across 400 million acres of grassland, built by animals working generation after generation, dismantled in a single decade of industrial slaughter. The homesteaders who complained of water shortages, who dug wells 300 feet deep into the aquifer, who abandoned their claims during the droughts of the 1890s, were farming in the aftermath of an ecological catastrophe they did not understand. They blamed the weather, the soil, their own lack of preparation. They never knew that the water infrastructure they needed had existed until a few years before their arrival. Today, roughly 500,000 bison live in North America, most on private ranches managed for meat production, a fraction of 1% of their historical population. Approximately 90% of these animals are owned by private individuals rather than government or conservation herds. But restoration efforts continue to expand. The Nature Conservancy manages herds at preserves from Kansas to Montana, studying how reintroduced bison affect grassland ecosystems. The Intertribal Buffalo Council, formed in 1992, has transferred more than 1,800 animals to tribal lands as of 2020. More than 60 tribes are actively involved in returning buffalo to reservation lands. Researchers document new wallows forming on these managed properties, watch amphibians colonizing the depressions within a few years of bison reintroduction, study the cascade of effects rippling outward from each restoration site. At Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota, bison maintain active wallows across 28,000 acres of mixed grass prairie. Depressions there measure 8 to 12 feet in diameter, exactly the dimensions Percy Crothers noted when he arrived in Dakota Territory in 1881. In Badlands National Park, wallowing maintains ecological disturbances that support native flora in mixed grass prairie environments. At the American Prairie Reserve in Montana, managers observe wallows developing on expansive grasslands as bison herds expand. The process that built the prairie's water infrastructure over 10 millennia continues wherever bison are allowed to behave as bison. Laura Ingalls Wilder published By the Shores of Silver Lake in 1939, when she was 72 years old. The book includes a chapter titled Where Violets Grow, in which she describes the old buffalo wallow on her father's claim as a place where fairies might dance. Her father explained how the depression formed, buffalo wallowing in the dust which blew away, creating the basin that collected spring rains. By then, Laura understood what she had witnessed as a child traveling west in 1879. The buffalo are gone, Laura thought. That single sentence, buried in a children's book read by millions, captured something the scientific literature would take another 50 years to articulate. The animals that shaped this land had vanished, and with them a way of being on the prairie that no amount of homesteading could replace. The wallows Laura saw from her father's wagon represented the last visible evidence of an ecosystem built over geological time and destroyed in a single human lifetime. In the spring of 1880, Charles Ingalls built his family a shanty on their Dakota claim, broke sod for planting, and dug a well for water. 50 yards south of their home stood the old wallow, 2 acres of compacted earth holding the spring rains. His daughter found violets there and her lost sister playing among them. His granddaughter would never see that wallow. By the 1920s, the slough had swallowed what remained of the depression, filling with sediment and vegetation. Today, topographical maps show a faint circular contour beside a small wetland on the Ingalls homestead property outside De Smet. The water still collects after a fashion, where bison once rolled in the dust to drive away flies. But the engineers who built that catchment have been gone for 140 years. The prairie they created is mostly memory, and the species that depended on their work grow fewer with each passing decade. The holes in the ground that settlers dismissed as useless turned out to be exactly what the landscape needed, and exactly what it lost.